Hey everybody, today we're going to continue our investigation of open economies by looking at what's known as the balance of payments. Our goal is to be able to explain what we mean by the balance of payments and why all payments balance, and be able to differentiate between what are known as the current account and financial account. And finally, we'll look at why capital flows from one country to another. So Steve Heimler has a really good explanation for the balance of payments on his YouTube channel, and I'll link to that in the description. And it's worth taking a look at to further your investigation on what we mean by balance of payments. Essentially, when we're talking about the balance of payments, we're interested in the flow of goods and financial assets. When we talk about the flow of goods, we're talking about exports and imports. Exports, from a U.S. perspective, are goods made in the United States and sold in another country. So exports are anything that are produced domestically and sold internationally. Imports are the opposite. They are goods produced internationally and sold domestically. So anything made outside the United States and then brought into the U.S. is considered an import. What we're interested in is the net exports. That is, we take the value of all the goods that we ship out to other countries, and we take the value of the goods that we bring in from other countries, and we subtract the two. If exports are greater than imports, then we have a trade surplus. We're sending out more than is coming in. If our exports are less than imports, then we have a trade deficit. We are sending more or bringing in more goods from outside our country than we are sending them out. Now, it's not necessarily good or bad, right or wrong. You can have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. There's not necessarily a positive value on one over the other. It just is what it is. In the United States' situation, we have pretty much maintained massive trade deficits over the last several decades, but as a result, the country gets to enjoy the finest goods from around the world, which in many cases is sort of a net benefit. So there's not necessarily a judgment on whether trade surplus or trade deficit exists in one country or the other, especially because, as we're going to get to in a second, this all balances out. So when we're looking at net exports, we're talking about what's known as the current account. So that current account is measuring the value of goods and the flow of goods to and from a particular country. The flow of capital falls under what's known as the financial account. And you can have outflows or inflows. An outflow of capital is when foreign assets are purchased by people from the United States or domestically. So domestic people using resources purchase foreign assets. And inflows of capital occur when domestic assets are being purchased by people from outside your country. And so there is sort of a deficit or a surplus of capital. Capital is either flowing into your country, into investments, or it is flowing out of your country into investments in other countries. And what we find is that the balance of payments, the current account plus the financial account, equals zero. Meaning, if you have a surplus in one, you essentially have a deficit in the other. And this is always and everywhere a fact because of mathematics and because of sort of international trade. Let's give an example. Let's say that Target, based in the United States, chooses to buy $20 million worth of clothing manufactured in China. So Target is going to send money to China, and China will send clothes in exchange. So we see here that there is a trade deficit for the United States because they're importing $20 million worth of goods. But there is then also capital flow from China into the United States. Now that's the part that is really hard, I think, for a lot of people, is understanding that there is a capital inflow into the United States, essentially along with the imports. Now, why? Well, we look at the balance of payments and we say, well, the U.S. received $20 million in product. China received $20 million in American currency. And so the question is, what are the Chinese recipients of the $20 million in cash going to do? Well, they have two choices. The recipients of this $20 million in cash in China can either purchase goods from the United States, in which case they will import goods from the United States, and by sending American goods into China, we're beginning to sort of balance out that current account deficit, because now instead of being $20 million trade deficit, it will be something less than a $20 million trade deficit as U.S. goods flow into China. Or the Chinese investors who have this $20 million in cash can choose to buy U.S. financial assets. Keep in mind, like we learned in last class, you need American dollars to do things in America, and American dollars are only really good in the United States. So the recipients of $20 million in China and U.S. dollars have to do something with it. So they either buy U.S. goods, reduces the current account deficit, or they take that $20 million and put it into the United States and purchase U.S. financial assets, bringing capital into the U.S. But in either way, no matter what choice they make, there has to be a $20 million purchase either of assets or goods to go along with the $20 million in product that the United States bought. As a result, the balance of payments will come out to be zero. And we want to spend just a little bit of time thinking about why capital will flow from one country to another. And when we're looking at those capital markets, we're looking at the loanable funds market. So think back to Unit 4 or 3 with the loanable funds market. And we know that the decisions that people make are based on rate of return, that investors like to get the biggest rate of return possible on their money. So when we look at this model, we're going to assume that all capital flows are in the form of loans. So we're sort of simplifying real life to fit into a model. And we're going to pretend that exchange rates have no impact at all, that all else being equal, that money can flow from one country to the next basically without cost. If that's the case, then we're looking here, we can see that in the United States, maybe the prevailing real interest rate or rate of return is 4% on loans, but in Japan, it's 7%. Well, we know that investors have a choice in an open economy. They can put their money in the United States or they can put their money in Japan. All else being equal, looking at those two countries, investors will prefer to have their capital flow into Japan because they'd like to get that higher rate of return. And so what that would mean is that investors in the United States would take their money out of the banking system, away from loanable funds in the United States. And when they do that, the supply of loanable funds will shift to the left in the United States, causing there to be an increase in the real interest rate. And as a result of pulling their money out of the United States, they're going to place it into Japanese loans, which is going to cause the supply of loanable funds in Japan to shift to the right, causing the interest rate, real interest rate in Japan to drop. And those flows will keep shifting until we get a real interest rate that is equal in both the United States and in Japan. So in this example, what we would see is a capital outflow from the United States and a capital inflow in Japan. We have some more practice problems to work through to try and get our hands around the balance of payments, and we'll work on those in class. And I'll be happy to answer questions when I see you next. Take care.